Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by today to learn more about my capstone research. My name is Julie Tolmie and I'm a senior in environmental studies. I'll be graduating this June. And today I'm going to talk to you about tribal climate adaptation priorities. So to give you some background, Native Americans are among the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. One reason for this is that many of them rely on subsistence foods, such as this here, to supplement their diet and maintain cultural traditions. Now, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency wants to support tribal nations as they adapt to climate change, but the agency doesn't have a good understanding of tribal nations' priorities. One way EPA is trying to address this problem is by using the climate adaptation priorities that tribal nations list in EPA Tribal Environmental Plans, or ETEPs. I thought it was important to investigate how effective ETEPs are as a method to gauge tribal climate adaptation priorities. So in my research, I asked the question, how do the climate adaptation priorities that tribal nations list in ETEPs compare to the physical climate change impacts expected by scientific literature? I think it's important to note here that a lot of scientific research on how climate change is impacting tribal nations is conducted by or in collaboration with members of tribal nations, so it serves as a pretty good benchmark. I started investigating this question as an intern with EPA Region 10 this summer. I worked with EPA's Tribal Climate Adaptation Project to identify which climate impacts tribal nations view as priorities and what resources EPA currently offers to assist with adaptation. To determine tribal nations' climate adaptation priorities, I reviewed environmental plans that tribes in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska had submitted to EPA. I categorized these issues, and then outside of my internship, I reviewed academic literature on how climate change will impact Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, which includes Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and 2 tribal nations. What I found was that the most commonly cited priorities were a loss of biodiversity in culturally important species, followed by coastal and riverbank erosion, and reduced water quality. You can see more about my findings here. The ETEPs didn't emphasize or address some issues anticipated by scientific research, though, such as increased risk of wildfire, increased irregularity of weather, and decreased forest productivity. Now, there are several reasons why the ETEPs offer an incomplete picture of tribal climate adaptation needs. One could be that the ETEPs don't explicitly ask tribes about climate change. It's up to tribal nations themselves to volunteer this information. It's important for EPA and other government agencies to develop a better understanding of tribes' climate adaptation priorities so that they can better support climate adaptation efforts. They can offer more targeted tools, more targeted resources, and more targeted funding. So how can EPA make sure that they do this? How can EPA make sure that they can provide resources like this one, the Tribal Adaptation Menu, which was developed by the Great Lakes Indian Fisheries Wildlife Commission? Well, EPA can do this by revising the ETEPS forms to explicitly ask about climate change impacts and consulting tribes when making decisions about climate change and climate adaptation. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you guys again so much for stopping by. And I think it's important to give a shout out to a few other people who helped me out along the way. Vicky Salazar and Sarah Frederick, my supervisors at EPA, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this work. Thank you, Arthur Wendell and Erin McPike, for trusting me with a second EPA and ATSDR project. And thank you to Mead Crosby for providing guidance, and my family and cohort for your support along the way. If any of you viewers out there have any more questions about my research, you can ask me them via my Twitter account down here at Julie Tolmie. I'll be monitoring that to answer any questions you might have. Thanks again for stopping by. I really appreciate that you wanted to spend your time on this.